Okay, here we have a crankshaft from a 500cc Indian Royal Enfield Bullet with the big end well and truly worn out, as we can see. So what I'm going to attempt to do here, I've been asked, I've often made clips showing my crankshafts when I finished them, and them getting spun between centres in that lathe over there with the clocks on them to check, make sure that they're running as true as possible. This time I'm going to try and merge a number of smaller clips together and hopefully tell the story of the job from start to finish. So there's the crank ready to be dismantled. I'm going to get this lock screw out next and undo this nut, and then we'll come back to it when I'll have the crank in the fly press to split it in two and press the crank pin out. So that'll be the next stage of the job. Right, here we are, all set up with the crankshaft set up ready to be split in the fly press. So hopefully you'll get a reasonable view of that, and hopefully hear what I'm saying and see what happens. I'm going to bring the weight of the fly press down onto the crank pin and hopefully press it out from the drive side. Just move my supports in closer together. The closer they are together, the better. Right, let's try that. There it goes. A lot of this the fly press's work is done by inertia and momentum rather than sheer brute force itself. And there we go, that's the timing side removed from the drive side flywheel. You can see that big end is well shot. In fact, barely anything left of the floating bush, half of it's worn away. Anyway, that's what we're here for, to change all this. So I'll just put that there at the moment, and we'll flip the drive side flywheel over. Sorry, timing side. Drive side's leave the crank pin now, so we put this one in there. Do the same again. Now the end of the mandrel in the fly press is a bigger diameter than the crank pin, so I use this nut as a spacer. Just put it in there so that the mandrel of the fly press gets another go at it. And there we are. I'll need that next time we do another crank. And that's the crank pin out of the timing side flywheel. And everything's ready for checking, reassembly with the new parts, and obviously truing up. So I'll get these components into the workshop now, check them over, and the next stage will be reassembly, all being well. Right, next stage of this Royal Enfield 500 Bullet crank rebuild. I've got the flywheels separated as we saw earlier on. I've got my new components here. There's a new conrod, a new floating bush. Over here is a new crank pin which I've put into position. A couple of points about this. The oil hole there in the crank pin has got to face directly towards the centre of the main shaft, because there's an oil hole through the flywheel there that links up with the main shaft, and the end feed in the main shaft on the timing side of the engine goes through that main shaft, links up with a hole in the flywheel, which then has a passageway going towards the crank pin location. In fact, I'll pull the crank pin out perhaps and we can have a look. Bear with me. pushed it in, I think I might have it ready for pressing in with the fly press, but let's take a look at it anyway. There's a couple of other points here to talk about. Whether it can be seen there, but there is an oil hole there in the flywheel, which has to join up obviously with the oil hole in the crank pin. So it's important to have the crank pin the right way up obviously, and also get that oil hole facing the one in the flywheel. First thing to go into place though is the thrust washer, and even the thrust washer has to go a certain way round. There's a chamfer facing that hole in the centre of it there, and the chamfer faces the shoulder of the crank pin. So we put that there, the thrust washer there like that, with the chamfer facing us, ready to make up with the shoulder on the crank pin. And then you can really do it by eye, excuse me, but you have to get that oil hole in the crank pin lined up, as I said, as close to the centre of that as you can. There is a little margin for error, in that there's a bit of a counter bore there, and the hole in the crank is also quite generous, but it's best to be as accurate as possible. So just get that into position. There it is, and that's ready to go into the fly press now, and I'll press that home, get the nut on it and tighten it up, and then that is done, and we'll fit the connecting rod, floating bush, and then offer the drive side flywheel up, and that is where the truing work begins. So the next step now is just press this home and get the nut on and do it up tight. Welcome back to Wales on this lovely day. I'll have to get this fly press under cover I think sometime. Anyway, it'll do the job. I'm going to just, as I said before, I've got the new crank pin fitted, thrust washer facing the right way around, and I'm just going to press the crank pin into the timing side flywheel now, ready to get the nut on and tighten it up and lock it into position. That's it. That's all the way home, and I'll get the lock nut on that now, and that will finish the job, and then we'll set about getting the other flywheel and the conrod and big end into position and put it all together. Here we are at the next stage of the job with the Royal Enfield 500 Bullet crankshaft. I've got the crank pin pressed into the timing side flywheel now, and fully home, and the nut is actually, you can't see it, but the nut is on and completely tightened, and even a little locking grub screw just to make sure that that nut never comes undone is in place. So this is all done, ready to go. If anyone happened to notice and would like to criticise when I was outside pressing that crank pin in that it was raining and the flywheel got a bit wet, well, I've blown any traces of water off with the airline and cleaned it with clean paper towel, so that's all clean and dry, no problem there. I've got the conrod, floating bush, and both thrust washers obviously in place. So the one went in before the crank pin, the other one's there, and I've oiled the components. So the next step will be get the drive side flywheel here, which I've cleaned up, ready, into position, like so. And incidentally, with these flywheels and crank pins, the fit is very important. I didn't mention that at the time when I had the timing side, the crank pin going into the timing side, but should the crank pin drop in much more than halfway, I'd be very concerned about the fit and maybe consider using an oversized crank pin. But the timing side flywheel took the crank pin about halfway, and then I had to finish it with the press, so that's good enough for me. And as you can see on the drive side here, we've got the weight of the drive side flywheel on the crank pin, and it's come to a stop way before the end of travel, so that means there's a good bit of press fit left, so that will be good. So I'll roughly true this now, I'll just do it by eye, and then what I'll do is I'll start getting the flywheel moved onto the crank pin a little. I won't go all the way, and then I'll start kind of roughly through it before I finish it off and press it all the way home and put the nut on, but I won't be tightening the nut. I'll just have it sort of finger tight or maybe very gently nipped, and then the final truing can begin. So that's where we'll be heading next. Here we are now with the flywheels roughly assembled, and I haven't got them pressed all the way together yet, as you can see by the side to side play in the conrod there. So there's a fair way left to go before those flywheels, or the drive side flywheel, is fully home on the crank pin. But that's how I want it for now. I've got it pressed on far enough that the crank pin's got a reasonable grip on the flywheel, and I can make my fine adjustments now. And you'll see that that's just put together by eye, and there's quite a lot of run out there. I mean, that would be very, very unacceptable. Well, I wouldn't put it together and put it in an engine like that anyway, although some seem to come out like that. We've got quite a rise and fall there, and also, whether the camera will pick it up, there's a fluctuation in the gap between the flywheel faces as well. So I'm going to have to square that up. That should come good when the flywheels are pressed home fully together. So I'm going to squeeze them together a bit more now, probably actually press them all the way home, but not tighten the crank pin lock nut up. I'll just do it finger tight or perhaps a little more, and then I'll start bumping the flywheels to hopefully get the final alignment and truing up done. All being well, that's usually all it takes, but this is the first time I've filmed the procedure, and I'm hoping that perhaps shortly, rather than a series of small videos linked together, perhaps I can finish off with this camera will do 29 minutes in one hit, and maybe I'll be able to do an unedited video to finish off with, and hopefully finish up with a true set of flywheels ready to go. Well, here we have that Royal Enfield 500 Bullet crank again, and the flywheels are pressed together now, and the crank pin nut is fitted and just nipped up. It's not really tightened up yet, because I still want to be able to bump the flywheels and just fine tune and minimise any run out. And at the moment, see, we've got far too much. That clock is showing just over 0.5 millimetre, so there's no point even worrying about how many thousandths of an inch we got or whatever. But notice how the high spot is there when the connecting rod is pulled towards me. The high spot is on the drive side, so that means that with the conrod pulled out towards me like this, I want to bump the crank assembly on my block of wood, and I want to hit the timing side flywheel on the block of wood. So I'm going to set the camera down now, and I'll get the crank out, and we'll do that. I'll just borrow this Royal Enfield Bullet engine here because I think it'll stand up to my camera, hopefully. And we can see the block of wood there. I'll get the crank. So I've got the connecting rod pulled out towards me. This is the timing side flywheel, which I want to bump on a piece of wood to hopefully bring the drive side flywheel down a little relative to it. You need to give them a fair wallop. Let's take a look at what we've got, see if there's any change. It's come down to well under 0.5 millimetre now, but I need to bump it again, so I'll repeat the process and hopefully we'll see a reduction again. Just put that camera down there a moment. So Same again, conrod pulled out towards me and bumped the timing side flywheel. Let's bring you guys over to see what we've got. Now then, that's getting somewhere near. Although notice how the clocks are not rising and falling together, but going in opposite directions. But that's no problem. I still need to bump the timing side flywheel a little more, but we're getting close now. So I'll keep filming for now. I may stop because this could come good next time, or it could take all day, and that would make for a very boring series of clips of video. I'll put the camera back down now and we'll take a look at the block of wood again. Just feast your eyes on that block of wood while I get the crank. So we're getting pretty close now, so the danger is that I could hit the flywheels on the block of wood and go past the optimum point, but it's just luck of the draw really. Here we go. Not such a big whack this time. Let's see what we've got. Let's move that back to where it'll pick up the reading. I don't think I made any impression on it that time. So I'll have to take it back to the block of wood and hit it a little harder. I'll keep filming for now, but I may switch off if this is going to drag on. Back in a moment. Same again, conrod out towards me, and I'm going to bump the timing side flywheel down on the block of wood. Now that should have shifted. I've just destroyed my WD-40 can. So got the top has come off it. Right. Well, you can see that that was a fair whack anyway, so that should have changed it a little. And let's look for any change this time. Yes, that's coming down. Not quite there yet, but it would be worth it if I continue filming and do it again. We might just get into the zone. Hopefully not knock too many things flying off the bench. There's the block of wood. I'll just shift these things. No point in having all sorts of things bouncing off the bench when there's no need. And we can see the block of wood there still. Right. I still need to bump the timing side flywheel on the block of wood, but I don't really want things to change very much, so I'm hoping it doesn't go beyond the optimum. But if it does, I'll just have to start going the other way. Here we are then. And let's see what we got this time. That's getting very close now. That's getting very close. In fact, high spot now is actually adjacent to where the crank pin area is, which means that any run out we see in there might be down to the flywheels not being entirely parallel. So what I'll do next, I think, is I'll tighten the crank pin nut and then we'll take another look at it. And that is getting pretty close now. Not good enough yet, mind, but getting close. I'm going to stop the camera now because otherwise this is going to get a bit monotonous for everybody. We're nearly there, and obviously I'll be carrying on in the manner that I've shown. I'm just going to tighten the crank pin nut and then I'll put the flywheels back between centres and see what we've got. Here we are again with this crank assembly for a Royal Enfield 500 Bullet, and I think I'm done with it now. I've got the drive side crank pin nut on and done up tight, and I've got my dial gauges here now, which we'll pay a bit more attention to the numbers on them now. Both of them are showing 0 there. This one on the left, as usual, reads in thousandths of an inch, and from the 0 to the 5 is 5/1000ths of an inch. This one is metric, and from the 0 to the 10 is 0.1 of a millimetre, or 4/1000ths of an inch. So the sort of divisions between one number and the next on both clocks are very similar. I mean, obviously we've got 5 thou on one and 4 thou roughly on the other, but they're good enough for my purposes. And I'm going to rotate the crank now and see what we've got. And as we can see, there's a slight run out on both, but the needles are rising and falling together, so one effectively cancels the other one out because I've got them where the main bearings run on the main shafts. And we can see on the Imperial one we've got certainly no more than 3/1000ths of an inch run out there, and on the metric one, that's the Imperial one, this is the metric one, we've got, well, we're not even moving half the division, which would be 4/1000ths of an inch if it moved to the next number. So we've got about 2/1000ths of an inch there, I would say. One cancels the other one out, so we've actually got a real world 1/1000th of an inch run out there at the main bearings on the main shafts. So that'll certainly do for me. That'll be no problem at all. It'll be a job to get better than that. So I think I'm going to call it a day there. There's no point trying to get better than that, because if I bump the flywheels again, they'll probably wander further away from that, and then I'll have to start the whole process again. So that should give a lovely smooth running bottom end anyway. So that's the job completed.